Good morning, John.
Morning, Tom.
And how are you doing today?
I am well. I think you know I'm in Vegas,
Oh, okay.
and
I may have
um,
known and forgotten.
welcome to the club.
Yeah.
But I got a late checkout, so I'll need to check out from our session about 11:30, just so
Mhm.
that I don't run into conflict. But Palace Station sent me a nice happy birthday um, special discount on rooms. So I
Oh,
decided to take advantage. Haven't been here for a while.
good.
And I think you know I sold the condo that I had out in this area. And so last night took my realtor out to dinner to celebrate. She did a great job.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. So has Vegas been one of your hangouts, shall we say?
Well, let me put it this way. About 40 years ago, the company I worked for opened a branch here,
Uh-huh.
and I was the liaison. So
Ah,
for a couple months, I was here.
oh, okay. Phil Berryman just entered, so I'm going to admit him. Hello, Phil. And Ned has come
Testing.
in.
Can you hear
Hello.
us?
There he is. Hello, Phil. Hello, Ned.
Um, Hi, Phil. Hi, John.
Hi.
Good
How are you guys?
morning. Happy Friday from Vegas,
From Vegas.
celebrating my birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank
What are you,
you.
90?
Yes.
I felt that way about 2 hours ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, happy birthday. And here comes George Crook.
Hi, George.
Hi, George.
There he is.
Órale, ladrón.
Hello,
Look at
George.
this. What's the haps?
What's on your shirt, George? Stand with what?
Oh,
The
Armenia.
Mafia? Arena?
Armenia. Mafia. I've been there. Armenia.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
You
and I
know,
think
if
George
Fred is
Derrick will not be with us. So
Right.
I think it is us and Phil. And thank you for joining us, Phil.
Yeah, Phil.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for joining us.
So what is this group? Give me the backstory of it.
We're just a couple of weirdos, or a bunch of weirdos.
Yeah. Well,
Speak for yourself, Essay.
That's right. I should just speak
So
for myself.
Phil, when you were in sixth year, we all started 1956 as freshmen at Our Lady Queen of Angels. So we were all classmates starting back then.
Okay. So far, so And good. Fred Lawrence was in the class too?
A year ahead of us.
You're ahead. Yeah.
yeah. And this group kind of immediately got started back in, when was it? Last year, last fall, late in the
Yeah.
fall, early spring,
Yeah.
when Ned Shavira called me just to check in. Hey, Tom, you've been on my mind. How you doing? And we talked, and I think we talked again one or two more times on the phone. And I think we got John and George in to the group. And then I
George.
kept trying to find a way, George Crook, and then we got George
Well,
Ferry.
but don't forget Ferry.
And I kept looking for a way to maybe involve us all on a FaceTime call or something. Well, FaceTime just doesn't work for that kind of stuff. So I decided to take out a pro account for Zoom, which enables unlimited gatherings like this, and I think fairly high video quality and all of that. So, so we thought, well, let's get together and chat, basically, fill up on old times. For we kind of hit upon Friday as being the time that was kind of convenient, or at least less inconvenient for most of us. And so we just kept kind of talking about all kinds of things, reminiscing seminary days, and talking about goings on in the church, and real presence versus transubstantiation, and getting into all kinds of stuff like that.
Well, Tom, you got that. Transubstantiation invariably leads to real presence.
Yeah, they're not
versus.
Yeah,
right. Well, no, that was time.
I'm just playing.
But I don't know. It was kind of suggested. Why don't we see if we can get Phil in for at least one session and pick his brain, because you've got such a fabulous history. And with that, I'm going to leave it just up to the others to start talking.
Bill, when would you? When were you ordained?
Yeah, I actually, with John in an email, I said, well, why don't I just spell out in a couple minutes what I've been doing for 60, 70 years, and we can go from there. But I have in mind.
That's what I was going to say.
You know, and this is all in my memoir, which came out in 2 years ago. But
oh, really?
Yeah, maybe I should have brought an ad or something. It's called Memento of the Living and the Dead, and it is a memoir that goes way back even to seminary times and so forth. What drove me to do it was my experience in Latin America, but it turned out to be covering pretty much up to the present. Anyway, I was in the seminary with you folks, ordained in '63, spent 2 years in Pasadena at St. Philip's, and then went to Panama, not in any program. At the time, the diocese was happy to get rid of me. And Hawks even called, I had expressed a desire to go to Latin America, and Hawks even called me in early '65 asking how it was going. So anyway, I joined a group of Chicago priests in Panama City at a place called San Miguelito for a year. Then for 7 years, I was a pastor of a downtown poor parish in Chorrillo, downtown Panama City. But at that same time, I became linked up in Latin America, the Latin American Catholic Church. I studied in Ecuador in '68 at IPLA, the Pastoral Institute, then traveled by land around South America for 4 months afterwards, looking into what was happening. Came back and we can go to the story in Panama, but I was there for 4 more years. In '73, left, and lots of things were happening, the Torrijos dictatorship and so forth. Left to get married in '73. Angie and I got married. We were in San Jose briefly, but then we took another land trip through Latin America. We were looking for what to do. We came back to Philadelphia, and we were here in '76, excuse me, '76, where we took a job with the American Friends Service Committee in Central America, based in Guatemala. So from '76 to '80, we were there, and our assignment was to follow what was happening. So not only Guatemala, but El Salvador and so forth. So for example, and I'll just mention it, I was leading an ecumenical delegation in El Salvador when Romero was killed. So we were right there, not in the mass where he was killed, but in the country. And I was at the funeral and so forth. Anyway, we had to leave Guatemala mid-1980. In the early '80s, I worked on Central America issues, then began writing and translating, but really through the '80s, I was activist. By the end of the 80s, I was hoping that I might become a freelance writer. But by the early 90s, that wasn't happening. I was writing and so forth, but I wasn't contributing enough to the family income from that. And so I became a freelance translator of Spanish and Portuguese, and also taught adjunct Latin American studies at Temple. So, so that kind of took me through to, well, into the 2000s. In 2011, I stopped teaching at Temple. And around then, I was working on a book on Latin America, which came out in 2016, called Latin America at 200, a new introduction. But that was the outgrowth of my teaching. So I had spent a number of years summarizing, but an attempt at an introductory book better than the ones on the market at the time. After that, I continued to translate and worked on my memoir. And even to this day, I'm occasionally doing translation. But since doing the memoir, my major project has been delving into the history of Christianity, not doing any original work, but seeing what scholars have been saying in the last few years, writing it up. It may end up being a book someday. I don't have a need to publish, but what I'm doing, besides doing some translation, is spending time looking at what scholars have been saying about particular questions that intrigue me. So I delve into it and write it up. So that's the long sweep of things there. But we could, well, the other thing, which I think I mentioned in an email to Tom, or maybe to all of you, I don't know, is that I've kept up an interest in things theological, not professionally, but since, well, around the time we got married, so that's 40 some years ago. On Saturday and Sunday mornings, I read from 6 to 9, basically, drink coffee and read things related. It could well be history, occasionally philosophy, scripture, and so forth. So it's promiscuous reading, but what it means is that I've stayed in contact with what's happening in theology, not writing about it, although I've translated some theologians. But anyway, those are the. But I've kept up an active interest. So those are some of the. Well, and Fred, around, I never met Lonergan, but I read him back in illo tempore, and starting in around 2000, occasionally began to go to the Lonergan workshops through invitation of Fred, and I've made a few presentations there and so forth. So one area has been Lonergan, for example. But anyhow, those are some of the things that, now I assume that, I mean, there may be other things, but I assume that this is going to be the takeoff point for one or other topic in this. Is that how you work, or is that what you did with Fred, for example?
Sure.
Very informative.
One of the things I'm always curious about is mentors, mentoring. I don't know if you've ever come across a book called T-A-O Mentoring, but I'm very conscious and curious about how my mentors have affected me and how mentors have affected my associates like this. And if we are taking the position in this stage of life to be mentoring others. And I'm curious about who might have been mentors for you, Phil, and if you see yourself mentoring at this stage.
Well, in doing the memoir in particular, I at some point figured I called them father figures, but I figured they're all male. Uh, they all um, they all had an influence, and if you know if the word mentoring had been around that far back, might well have called it. But the ones in my, it's quite clear. It's John Cofield, priest in L.A. that I
All
spent
of
a
us know
summer,
him.
the summer of '58 at Dolores Mission. Leo Mann, the head of the Chicago priests in San Miguelito, who they arrived in '63 and began doing an early version of Comunidades de Base before the term was around, about 5 years before the term came into use. But that's why I went to San Miguelito, was this pastoral method. So Leo was one. Um, Another was Gary McCoy, the Irish American journalist, who I first met in 1970, who came and stayed with me and then continued on this trip. A fourth one was Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, popularized the term conscientización, consciousness raising. I was with him in a course in Chile in the first few weeks of 1969, and his method of working with poor people, you know, in some ways I put him, like I say, a father figure. Now, who is the fifth? There's a fifth that I'm forgetting, but it may come back to me. But
Charlie Barr.
interesting, but no, not. Obviously, there's got to be somebody there. Anyway, but and frankly, though, I don't think I've been a mentor to many others. Circumstantially, I taught, but it was adjunct undergrad teaching. I don't think, people appreciated the class. I don't think I became a conscious mentor of anybody there. It may be just a circumstantial thing. It's these days in business and elsewhere, we all know the importance of that kind of relationship, but I don't think I've had it for whatever reason.
If I may, my second question of you is, Mike Malloy was a classmate of ours and has written a textbook on comparative religion and a book on Christianity. Are you familiar with Mike Malloy and his work?
At your suggestion a few years ago, I got the book on, and I did read it in my Sunday mornings. I read it.
Was it World Religions or Christianity?
Yeah, World Religion.
Uh-huh.
And I do see writing an intro is not the same thing as writing something. Writing an intro is for undergrads. You're targeting undergrads, and it's the kind of outgrowth of your work. It's not groundbreaking, except insofar as it may help teachers see things in a slightly different light or something. But anyhow, that's what the book felt to me like, was an introductory work, the outgrowth of years of teaching.
Yes, I think that's true.
One of the things that I'm very, very interested in, Bill, is your work in South America. I'm sorry, Central America. My son is married to a Salvadorian, has 3 kids, goes down there, and when he does, I have qualms. And he takes his 3 kids. He's a doctor, and he wants to establish some kind of clinic down there. I'm not familiar in any significant way with the history of El Salvador or Nicaragua. Um, I know about the work that you, well, I know that you worked down there quite a lot, and that you've written at least one, if not two, books on that work. And I'm most interested in that too. I don't know if the rest of you guys are uh, interested in that.
Sure,
Mhm.
all ears.
All ears.
Well, there could go the, the rest of the day in a way from simply because it was, but, um, well, particularly that 76 to 80 period. I mean, I first went to El Salvador in 67, I think, um, but from 76 to 80, we lived in Guatemala, and that's next door. The two capitals are about 5 hours apart.
Right.
And at the time, so then, and on history, the Central Americans were always very convinced that to understand their country, you have to understand the history. At the founding convention of the CISPES, the Solidarity Network with El Salvador, which was in 1980, a Salvadoran came in and he, with that idea, said, you have to understand El Salvador, you have to understand the history. And it took him 45 minutes to get into the 20th century. That was, I mean, that understanding was there. Those of us who did solidarity work eventually learned how to cut to the chase and help people understand without, but that conviction that the history is important. I wrote 2 books on the church in Central America, one published in 84 and one in 94, I guess. With that conviction that to understand that you have to understand the more remote history and the recent history. That's what I was trying to do. At the time, my generation thought that we were in the birth pangs of something better, through the 80s. Some people thought it would be a Cuba or Nicaragua style revolution, take state power and so forth. By the mid 80s, I thought, well, what we need is a peace process, not a soft landing of some kind. The disappointment has been that in the 30 years since 1990, more or less, none of those countries have gotten it together in terms of the welfare of the people. I mean, they've had conservative governments, a couple of them have left-wing governments. But they all have corruption. They have not, they're small. And part of the problem is if a country is small, that puts constraints on it. Unlike Brazil or Mexico, which are large. And if you're a small country, you have to figure out what you can do with what you've got. And part of it is a small population. You're not going to have an auto industry in El Salvador, for example. Brazil has aircraft industries and has had them for decades, but so size matters. But Costa Rica, which is in the same neighborhood, another small country, has done remarkably well in having a kind of modest society that works for Costa Ricans. During our years there, I didn't appreciate that enough. I thought of Costa Ricans as being self-satisfied and as being somewhat racist because they looked at they're largely white. They looked at other countries and there was at least a hint of racism in their sense of superiority. Anyway, it's not a paradise, but it has good institutions and has had democracy since the 19th, has had electoral democracy since the 19th century. and has a relatively more egalitarian structure, doesn't have a sharp racial line, and it abolished the army in 1949 or so. So it has not had a military. It's spent its revenues on schools and hospitals. Again, it's not but it's done, for example, in the recent decades, but 40 years now, it's encouraged ecotourism, and it's done very well at, I think, at preserving nature and using that for ecotourism. So it doesn't mean that these small countries can't do it. But so for me, one of the great disappointments is knowing that the pain of the 60s, 70s, 80s did not lead to very much for today's generations. Angie and I took a trip through Central America in 2011. We started in Guatemala and went to Panama for a month, traveling by land, staying with our old friends and so forth. And one of the discouragements was the thing that I'm saying, that seeing our aging friends and discouraged pretty much everywhere we went, to one degree or another. Anyway, we could go into a lot more. Those are some of the things that come off the top of my head. But you should have you been to El Salvador with your son-in-law?
No, I haven't.
Son or
Son,
son?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, Daniel is his name. Elsie is his wife, and he has a 15, our oldest grandson, 15-year-old, very bright young man, and two younger siblings.
Well, they have been to El Salvador.
They have been 4, 5, 6 times,
Mhm.
and Elsie never really wants to engage me in talking about it. She's a very bright woman. She works at Loyola Marymount University in spiritual studies, is assistant director of an office there, and teaches very much in Spanish, although she goes to other venues and speaks about contemplation and meditation, and very successfully. But maybe that interest of hers doesn't lend itself to remembering El Salvador. Now her family, when I talk with her cousins, they think it's a terrible mess. Very, very, very poor and very, very wealthy. No middle class. Oppressive. If you are not somehow connected with the right people, you are vulnerable, and not a good place. But that's as much as I can get at.
Well, but I would encourage you to entertain the idea of going sometime
Sure.
to appreciate the Salvadorans as people and the country, and to understand some of these pathologies that are. I mean, on that level, I cherish the memory of that. Although, in truth, we haven't been back since 2011, so that's 10 years now. We have not been back personally, so we ourselves haven't been back.
What do your friends in Central America think about it? You said that they have a great disappointment that things haven't become better.
Well, again, 10 years ago, some of them were still working in various NGOs and so forth. It is um, in some ways, I don't find them reflecting on, trying to understand what went wrong or something. I don't exactly get that. I'm not aware that Central Americans who have written their memoirs, for example, Ernesto Cardenal, what's his name? Various memoirs, Adios Muchachos, what was his name? Anyway, he was a minister. They're not very reflective. They're just sort of telling the glories of the past. I was at a thing in University of Texas, 2012 or so, of people from Central America trying to, reflect on things, and it wasn't. It was nice to see people, but I don't think it led to much insight. That's my recollection, anyhow. But more than that is the crime and corruption affect lots of things, and that's true in Central America. It's true elsewhere in Latin America. That they're, that's Kamala Harris right now. That's the dilemma that she and the Biden administration have. Is they would like to go to the roots of the problem, so to speak. And they would like to offer some aid, but you have to tackle corruption, and it goes right up to the top, and particularly in Honduras. But it's, I don't know what they could do. In other words, this is very much the legacy of the time that I'm talking about, 40 years ago, is unfortunately the legacy is very much up to the present.
Phil, in 1998, I was on a delegation from the archdiocese here to Honduras, in which we joined rather, people from the Office of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. And it was to deal with the question of the crushing debt of Honduras at the time. John Paul was talking about, forgiving third world debt at the coming millennium, 2000. And it was, we were very impressed with what we saw. Here's what we saw. That one, the Archbishop down there, now Cardinal, what's his name, Rodriguez, I guess, was clearly the most influential guy in the country. People said that he controlled, I think it was a third or 40% of the delegates in the National Assembly. If Rodriguez would say, vote this way, they did. And the president had offered him a job as head of the police force, an analog, I guess, to our FBI, shortly before we got there, and he turned it down. But at the time, he was a very charismatic guy. I mean, I remember going to mass at his cathedral one afternoon, and it was 5:30 and no archbishop, and we were looking at our watches, and suddenly this pickup truck comes screaming to a halt, and out he jumped, man of the people, et cetera, et cetera. I remember we had a dinner with the equivalent of the Attorney General of the country, the head of the FBI of the country, and I forget, I think maybe somebody from the Treasurer's office of the country. And the talk was of almost a velvet revolution that they had thrown. Apparently, I don't know, within the past year, there'd been a power struggle of some sort. I don't remember, but between the president, the then president, and the, I don't remember, I'm sorry, it was either the Supreme Court or the Congress. And such things had historically been resolved by the military. And the head of the chiefs of staff of the country famously had walked into the office of the president and said, dude, I'm not your enforcer. Do this right, do it democratically. Or at least that was the legend we were told. And, you know, we had the feeling that we were privileged to be at the creation of a brand new thing, that the country had really, really, truly turned a corner. I mean, these guys at that dinner had appeared to have stars in their eyes, you know, about the future. We drove to a meeting at the American ambassador's home, which was a palace. It was very clear as we drove onto that estate where the power in the country was, you know. And he assembled, and he was, who was president then? I guess 98, Clinton. Yeah. And the ambassador, frankly, came across as some hack. He just kept talking about Notre Dame's football team. And but he was able to convene people from the IMF, the World Bank, the Treasury of the US, the Treasury of Honduras. And we sat around talking about how much of the country's debt could be lifted from it. So we all came home thinking, boy, it's a new era down there. And not so, right? I mean, Honduras now is back to a military dictatorship. I understand, and it's a pretty bad one. What went wrong?
Well, here's a couple thoughts on, one of them is I mentioned the smallness of these countries. You know, in terms of Honduras, you know, Tegucigalpa and San Pedro together, I don't know, are they 1.5 million or 2 or something these days? In other words, the Central American countries are actually smaller and simpler. They're about like mid-size American cities. So the fact that you can meet everybody important, you know, if you were in Omaha, you wouldn't be too surprised if you could be in a room with movers and shakers there.
Right.
Well, that's similar to Central American countries. They're not that. So it's not quite so surprising that you can, and visiting gringos can do that and so forth. So in terms of perspective, that it's helpful to keep that in mind, that these places are small. You know, there could be some advantages in that if you really could address things, you might be able to do it, as opposed to being in Indonesia or something, you know, that where it's a lot bigger. I am not in on the ins and outs of Honduras in the last 20 years, because you're talking about something 20 plus years ago. But there was a situation in 2009. There's two situations where a populist president, Zelaya, had come in, a rancher type, but kind of turned populist, a little bit like Hugo Chavez, or at least that. However, he alienated his own party in Congress. The party moved to throw him out. The army put him on a plane in his pajamas to Costa Rica. So he was, and it was a kind of a coup, but you could say, well, it had a constitutional patina to it. At that point, every other country in Latin America didn't recognize the new government. I want to say Lobo, but the only ones that did was the Obama administration, which did recognize the, I would say, not very legitimate government. They did recognize, they should have, followed the lead of other Latin American countries and not done it. What they wanted to do was have elections and so forth. They're, we're now 10 years later, plus, we now have a situation where the president's brother of Honduras is, I think, in jail for drug trafficking. And we could be pretty sure that his brother, again, I guess his name is Lobo anyway, but his brother is involved. So Kamala Harris has to know that the head of the state is thoroughly involved in corruption. So what does she do about that? I don't know. So when I was younger, I, like people of my generation, thought that the important thing was the ideology of the group in power. And we wanted some sort of left, we didn't necessarily want violent revolution, but we wanted a group in power that could make the kind of changes needed, et cetera. That was the, but over time I've come to see that besides that the ideology may or may not be good, but the institutions of the society have to be good. And you have to, and this kind of runs through, how do you remedy that? But the court systems have to be honest. And in Honduras right now, there's a case where this is likely to come up. The killing of Berta Cáceres, a human rights activist. There's actually a trial on that now, and some lower level people have actually been jailed for it. But the trial is to go up to whoever gave the order, I'm forgetting the name, but it's a kind of a litmus test of the institutions of Honduras right now. And but again, I don't know what the answer is, but over the years, I've come to see the importance of solid institutions. Obviously, in our country, we saw a few months ago an example of our own institutions being endangered, and not only January 6th, but for a long period of time. Our institutions didn't seem as solid as we might have wanted. Now, take this to Honduras, but other places in, besides the claims of who's ever in office. And another thing, just on thinking about Latin America and so forth, it's not only the party in power at the presidential level or in the parliament level, it's how well things are at the state level, if it's a large country, in municipalities, that at different levels of government, and whether there, how much corruption there is and so forth, and how you reverse that. I don't know, but it can be done. It can be done, and that. But I think that's what reformers have to keep their eye on, besides simply capturing state power. But anyway, those are some loose thoughts on that. But I can sense you were there on a delegation and you were impressed by some of the things you saw and hopes. And what's his name, Rodriguez Maradiaga? I was with him on a panel of, some years before that, maybe even late 80s, at the Latin America Studies Association, a panel on the church in Latin America. Of course, when he was then a young, I think, Monsignor, and he came across the same way as you're saying, is very personable. And he's one of Francis's
Cabinet.
10, yeah. He seems to, but that, I mean, the thing that he'd be influential. Another thing, though, and this, bishops in Latin America, when I was at Montezuma in 1960, which was in a way where my desire to go to Latin America came up. This is the seminary in New Mexico.
New Mexico.
Right.
saw a visiting bishop, a rural bishop, and he was there in a kind of a beige cassock, and he even had on, in my mind anyhow, a pith helmet. Maybe I'm making that up, but a kind of like a rural thing. But what struck me was, and this was borne out over the years, particularly rural bishops could not be, I was going to say could not be jerks. Yes, they could be jerks, but they couldn't be, they didn't have the power or they're not sitting on top of a structure, and they're not managing lots of money. A diocese in Latin America, their annual budget may be like a parish in the United States. I mean, in terms of proportion, they don't manage a lot of assets. And in that sense, they don't have the barriers. So what you saw with Rodriguez, you know, I think it may have been more common among bishops in Latin America than, you know, a few of them, yes, will surround themselves with layers of bureaucracy and ceremony and so forth. But for the most part, by the very nature of their situation, they're more modest in, and there are fewer buffers between them and certainly clergy, but even lay people. It's one of the nice things about, that was nice for me to be in Latin America for those years, was to not be dealing with the whole panoply of power of U.S. hierarchy.
He was, yeah, very personable. One thing I just flashed on something you said a few minutes ago. I remember window shopping there. It was during the Olympics, and window shopping and looking at appliances, and they sure would not have been snapped up in this country, you know, in terms of quality. And somehow I just got the feeling this country is just not part of the world, not part of the world. I mean, it's so removed, so remote, so small, so isolated, that events that would get people talking excitedly in Paris or Rome or New York are just very far removed from this country. It's what do you call it? Backwater.
Backwater.
Yeah, and you know, they're not part of things. Was kind of my reaction.
Well, but you know, if you had lived there, you wouldn't think that way. In other words, if you, you know, we lived in Guatemala City for 4 years. You know, there were nice things about it. We were, you know, half-hour, 40-minute walk from downtown Guatemala City, from what was then the downtown. But the kind of modesty of things, the things you're talking about, was true. But you know, this is pre-internet and all that. But we, and Panama City. Panama is, you know, who I lived there for 8 years. And actually one of the kind of things that I got from that, I had grown up in LA, where it seemed like everybody in the world wanted to go to Southern California, right? When we were young, including people from elsewhere in the US, but around the world. And so I go to a place that is quite different. But I, you know, soon enough, well, I was involved in something that seemed pastorally very important and interesting and all that. But the thing you're talking about, the kind of backwater, yes, Panama never came into the attention of the world and so forth. But if you're living there, there are charms to being in one of these small places. And so when I would come back, or later when Angie and I would come back and go, for example, to a supermarket and see the whole aisle of pet food, for example, and this is some decades ago, we would be overwhelmed, but not positively. In other words, this would seem like if we were living somewhat in underdeveloped, this was overdevelopment. And so I, through the dozen years of living in Latin America and living and working and so forth, sort of decentered my view of the world.
Mm.
And I think even having come back, I've never, now we've now been back 40 years. So obviously in some ways, the US seems like the center of the world. But I keep reminding myself, well, it's only 4% of humankind. But I feel that I've been privileged to be able to live outside the US, and so to relativize American exceptionalism and everything. But that's one of the pluses of having spent years there. Hold on for a second. I'm going to take a phone call just for a second.
Okay.
You'll find things to talk about.
Jeez.
Are you among our four interested in shifting to Vatican II or religious oriented aspect, or do you want to stay on the Latin American theme?
I want to ask Phil about the role of the church down there, starting with John Paul and Archbishop Romero.
I say go. Yeah,
Yeah.
good idea.
Let's stick with that.
Yeah, and which, John, if you haven't studied it, I think you will hear it's a scandal. I wouldn't be shocked if Phil said that John Paul's or Romero's blood is on John Paul's hands. I wouldn't be surprised if he says that. There is that view. And what about today? What kind of a force is the church?
Yeah.
And I also want to ask you about the narcotraficantes and their control
Sure.
of these countries. And then after that, I'd be happy to go back to Benjamin Hawks or, the Vatican Council.
And a phone call from Hawks while he was down there, just checking how's it going?
Yeah, I bought his memoir already while we've been talking on Amazon.
Well, I have too, so he'll probably get a little bit of a royalty check from us.
A little bit.
Is that the 200 years book?
Memento of the Living and the Dead, a first-person account of church violence and resistance in Latin America.
Good for you.
Ned and I've been talking, John and I, going back to George Farrick's attitude towards the institutional church today. And I keep thinking that when Farrick was newly ordained and when, Fred was getting his doctorate in Switzerland and so forth, in LA, I wonder how much of an exaggeration it would be to say the church was evil under Hawks and McIntyre. It was certainly a racist church. I might throw that question at Phil, but at the rate I'm going, I'll be the only one of us allowed to talk. So I'll probably try to shut myself down at some point. But
well, speaking for myself, I can very much identify with your questions. They're not quite, in my experience, in a way that I could ask them, but I'm finding this fascinating. So even though I might be a silent partner in this line of talking, I'm sopping it up.
Yeah, Ned, I was surprised Phil suggested, oh, El Salvador, go on down, check it out. Take your
A little too,
grandkids,
but
have a picnic.
there's nothing like when I was working uh, initially at Unical, and we were thinking of buying land, and they did things big, huge pieces of land. The president never let us do anything unless we went to the site that we wanted to buy, and then mixed with the people around it and got to know the principals who had power in that area. It has to make a lot of sense to go down to really begin to get interested in and know what little questions to ask. I thought it was interesting as heck that he said scale is such a big thing. And I have experienced that going from the Archdiocese of Los Angeles and the bureaucracies that we've always had to contend with, and going to Fresno and seeing how the bishop relates to the priests there, just a completely different culture. Well, of course, this was back in the 60s. And Arizona, Troutman and those guys, again, a completely different culture, not so many formalities, not so much distance between, the bishop and the people who ran things. I was really taken also by what he said. Ideology isn't going to do anything or get anywhere unless the institutions that are there making it happen are amenable to the ideology. And I think immediately of Francis, going to Rome and facing up with the Curia, trying to figure out how he's going to get his ideology to work among those ensconced, often corrupt people. How do you do that in the stage where everybody's watching and listening and interpreting, what you're doing? I understand he's gotten some pro-abortion, very high-profile abortion people into the Curia, and the right just goes crazy. And
Yeah, but Ned, where do you understand that from?
From this website, Lifelight.
Yeah, they're probably kooks.
You think they're lying?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've made it a point to look at LifeSite News since I talked about it, with your son Marcos.
Yeah.
And it's an utter bunch of whack jobs.
Well, that doctor was, but
no. They're taking every position. I mean, I can't put my finger on stuff, but I mean, they just to look at a couple issues of it, they're crazy. They're not.
I agree with you about they're crazy.
But
Tom,
it's not just about abortion.
Like
they're taking. If you read, there'll be a dig about the authenticity of the election. Although I don't remember that. I think that is true, but I wouldn't swear to it. But just all kinds of right-wing bullshit.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Vaccines aren't safe.
There's a public honoring of this woman who was an environmentalist and quite a pro-abortionist, who was given a prize or a recognition by Francis, and they went nuts. Tom, what were you thinking? What were you going to say?
I regard LifeSite News as fake news. I mean, it is so biased and so
I agree with you.
one-sided that I simply I don't read it and I wouldn't trust it.
Yes, I agree. We've gone off a little bit, Phil, from but I was very taken by two things that you said. One, how important scale is with respect to sophistication and curbing corruption and getting something done. The other was related to it, ideology. Somebody's got a wonderful ideology, but the institutions of the country are so staid and you can't, if they don't work, there's no way that ideology is going to be able to become effective. At least that's what I heard you say.
Yeah, an example of that is Colombia and Venezuela, which are right next to each other and which are medium-sized countries. They're not small. Venezuela has had oil for a century plus,
Oh,
but it translated into a kind of a kind of wealth in Latin American terms. Venezuela was kind of at the level of Argentina, and for that matter, Panama, and just in terms of per capita income, average, going back decades. But oil doesn't bring real development, and Colombia has a more balanced economy. It's had conservative governments always at the national level, some left-wing governments in mayor's offices, but not. But things work a lot better in Colombia, and Colombians, it's a highly unequal society and so forth, but it's a society that works better than Venezuela. Venezuela had 15 years of Chavismo, and now Maduro, and ran the oil into the ground, polarized the country, or took advantage of the polarization that was already there, and hence the disaster of Venezuela. But the specific point of institutions, they work better in Colombia than a lot better in Colombia than in Venezuela. And Venezuelans as people are great and so forth, but like Gustavo Dudamel, but the oil has been a curse, I would say, in Venezuela.
I have a story to tell about that, but I don't think it's important enough. George, you had some great questions.
Oh, we were just talking. So what about, this is just, I think it comes out of my reading of Father Brockman's biography of Romero. I got the impression in reading that in the 79, 80, 77, the nuncio to El Salvador and Guatemala was the same guy, if I'm correct. And he was not at all sympathetic to anything Archbishop Romero thought to do or say. And as a result, I'm trying to remember, I think Romero went to Rome to see John Paul and was pretty much turned away, if not scolded, by John Paul. And word kind of went out, this guy's expendable. And, was John Paul kind of responsible for what happened to Romero, or blind to the situation because he was so afraid of communism down there, or what? I know it's an incoherent question.
I would avoid post hoc propter hoc.
Okay.
This thing happens, then that thing happens. So I didn't see Romero personally that often. But given as of even 76, a few months after we arrived in Guatemala, began to go to El Salvador. And so even before Romero came in, when Archbishop Chavez was still there. And my contacts were the Jesuits and some people at the UCA, the Jesuit University. And So in 77, I mean, I heard about things. I don't think I met Romero until maybe 78, that I had some particular business that I had to see him. But the kind of people around him I did see. So in other words, and so for 4 years, went to El Salvador and followed the developments there. Actually, in mid 77, I wrote an article for America with a pseudonym on about what had happened, including the killing of Rutilio Grande and Romero's accession and so forth. It was an article that covered maybe a recent year in El Salvador, including the church situation. I published it with a pseudonym because of the way things are in Central America, or were. Anyway, so I was following it enough in order to do some kind of journalism about it, and I continued to do that. I would go to his Sunday mass and so forth. So I followed it, and as I said, it was in the country when he was killed, leading an ecumenical delegation with people from USCC, a layman, religious orders, Quakers, and so forth. The specific thing of when there's a meeting where Romero goes to Rome to see John Paul, and it's what went on there. There's a woman named Maria Lopez Vigil who wrote a book, who's been a journalist. She's Cuban-born, raised in Spain, has lived in Central America for decades, a kind of church journalist. She told me this some years later, personally. She described this. She said that when Romero went to Rome on this visit, which it was after several priests were killed, several Salvadoran priests were killed. She said that he stopped in Spain on the way back, and she was with him for a number of hours, then he continued to El Salvador. At that point, according to her, he poured out his disappointment that when he had been there to see the Pope. He got the runaround for several days with Vatican bureaucrats. Eventually, he gets in to see the Pope, and he has given him some dossiers particularly on several of the priests who've been killed. At that point, there may have been 4 or something. Eventually, it was a dozen, but 4 at that time. And the Pope is scolding him, telling him, and he says, well, did you look at the material? And John Paul, brushes him off, saying, I don't have time to do that. So he's, and of course it is, John Paul's applying his template of communism to Central America and so forth. And seeing priests involved in politics and, judging it. And now, this is what Maria Lopez Vigil told me, and I think she's published it. If you look at his memoir, it's not there. And it seems like he returned, and he says something about his visit. Not his memoir, his diary. There's Romero's diary is published. And if you look up that date, he just kind of describes in general terms, but he doesn't put into the diary what at least Lopez Vigil told me, and I guess is in Brockman's bio. That I don't quite remember that, but
I don't remember the specifics about John Paul disregarding, files or folders about priests. I just remember it was a very chilly meeting.
It squares with my understanding of John Paul, that if there's anybody who was sure of himself, it was John Paul. And he and Romero had to deal with that. You know, he showed pictures of himself and he spoke publicly as though things had been fine. But yes, that is it's kind of squares, but Lopez Vigil told it to me personally, and I think it's in a booklet that she put together of remembrances of Romero too. So I mean, it sounds right to me, but I have a little moment of, you know, whose version is exactly reflects what actually went on. I don't know.
Yeah. In Washington once, I was one of 3 or 4 people that had breakfast with Romero's auxiliary, whose name I think was Rosas.
Gregorio Rosa, yeah.
Yeah.
Rosa, I think. Rosa,
Yeah.
something like that.
Very nice guy. And he told us that when John Paul went to El Salvador, he met for a meal with the country's bishops, who notoriously, you know, the outlying areas at least, had been anti-Romero, supposedly. And one of them said to John Paul que Romero fue comunista, su santidad. And John Paul said, no es verdad, no era comunista. And I don't remember if the next phrase was era santo or martir or something like that, but he, according to Rosas or whatever his name was, just angrily or vigorously contradicted that bishop about Romero being a communist. So go figure.
Yeah, well, that would have been in '83 when he made a trip through Central America. He caused a big scene in Nicaragua. That's another thing. But in Salvador, he off schedule, but of course in all the protocol and all that, he went to Romero's tomb and knelt down there. So, and this is '83, and more important, or just as important, this was March or April of '83, in a big speech, he used the word diálogo a number of times, encouraging, you know, some sort of, he didn't say negotiation, but he said diálogo. And other people in El Salvador couldn't say that at the time. So
what was the word, Phil?
Dialogue, diálogo.
Diálogo, okay.
So by that time, '83, but now this is 3 years after Romero's killed. But so what Rosa is saying, that he eventually came around, and I think it was the killing, and who knows what else, that he came around, and he by then he was encouraging some sort of a peaceful settlement, which still couldn't be done. It still took until the end of the decade, but John Paul came around. But the problem is that during that crucial early time, he apparently didn't. And that's, wasn't public, it was behind closed doors, but it's not surprising.
Yeah.
Reminiscent of apparently a conversation or a visit that John Paul had with the Jesuit Superior General, his name
Arrupe?
Arrupe, where supposedly, Arrupe is pretty much on his deathbed, and John Paul walks in and scolds him and tells him that he's going to take over the Jesuits for a while, et cetera, et cetera. Really, and if there's any truth to that, his self-confidence appears to me, to this Jesuit lover, to have been hubris.
Well, whatever he may have done in that encounter, he did, or the Vatican did, impose this Dutchman Kolvenbach,
Right.
as opposed to the one that the Jesuits either elected. The Jesuits should have elected. The Vatican imposed their candidate. You know, that's decades ago, but it did reflect the times. Curiously, the head of the Jesuits is now this Venezuelan, blanking on his name, but I went to see him in '93 when I was doing some research on the church in Venezuela, and he was at a interdisciplinary team of Jesuits. In other words, he wasn't a teacher, not a classroom teacher, but a kind of activist, a group of Jesuits that published a magazine and all that. And why I'm Arturo Sosa is his name, but then he was sort of middle-aged Jesuit, but out of that stream of the Jesuits, the kind of activist side, he is now the worldwide head of the Jesuits in Rome.
Yeah, Ned's source for the information we had was a Jesuit who was on the Archic Commission with the Anglicans, and had many meetings with John Paul, and didn't like him particularly. He said because Herbert, our friend, was an academic, and John Paul, was let many flowers blossom and all that. And John Paul was anything but that. And Herbert used to say he's the greatest pope of the last 1,000 years, but I don't much like him. There we had it. Phil,
I'm going to jump. Forgive me, George.
Sure.
I only have about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to have to take off because of the room clearance and all. But I'd like to pose, at least for some discussion, about Bergoglio's profile among the bishops of Central and Latin America.
Well, as I think I said in an email, Bergoglio and I are contemporaries. He's about 1.5 years older than I am. See, I think, and I wrote a thing or two about this a few years shortly after he came in, just kind of on the Latin American and Argentine background of Pope Francis in a journal. But and I translated the Aparecida document in 2007, which was the Latin American bishops document, but he was the kind of redactor and overseer of it. So I think at the time I had no idea who he was, but I spent some weeks with that document, turning it in English. So so I think I could see some. Thing is, he's the first pope who didn't have to retool after Vatican II. He was, he said his first mass in '68 or so. He had that long Jesuit period of training, the 15 years, whatever it is, but the 10 years. But all the others, even Ratzinger, he was brought up in the Tridentine Church, as certainly John Paul, with the added thing of under communism. But so if you think about Francis, from the time he was ordained, and the biblical renewal, from the time he was ordained, I'm assuming that he's been preaching on the texts of the day for 50 plus years. And that's his spirituality. It comes from that. It doesn't come from scholasticism. And and you can see it, I think. You can see it in that his spirituality. And if you ask yourself, what's his field? you know, he did teach literature and he taught some theology, but I think his field is spirituality. John Paul's field, and he was largely a classroom teacher, again under communism, but of philosophy. Ratzinger is patristic theology, but and very much a classroom type. Bergoglio was a Jesuit, but his I think, like I say, I think his field is spirituality. Very early, he was in administration. He was in administration during the military dictatorship. That's a brutal military dictatorship. That's a whole story there. But he almost, except for his period of exile in Cordoba and for less than a year in Europe, he's always been in Buenos Aires. So he's a person of the city. And of this particular city, this large city, Buenos Aires, unlike, like lots of people who may have done their pastoral work in the countryside, he's done his in the city. And I think all of those are, well, the other thing, he was exiled by the Jesuits to Cordoba for a few years. He was rescued from that by the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Corachino, who brought him in as auxiliary and set him up to be a successor. So he spent 20 years as a bishop, and his style, he didn't live in the palace. He lived in the curia, in chancery office, in a couple of rooms that he had there. And he gave up the common habit of going out to dinner. He basically didn't accept invitations to dinner, which would be from well-off people. So he could get up early and meditate, getting up at 4 or 5, whatever it is, drinking mate, the Argentine drink, and meditating before doing mass and getting on to whatever else he was doing. So and while he was there, opting to hang out in poor parishes as opposed to being sucked up into administrative things. So if you combine that, the practice of getting up early and meditating, and of doing as much as he could of hanging out with the poor, with their pastoral, but just with the people out in the barrios in Buenos Aires, I think that, and yet one of the kind of interesting things, which you probably know, but is that in 2005, he was the runner-up to Benedict. I mean, that came out later, but already he had something of a profile among the cardinals. And then his leadership on the Aparecida document, 2007, I think those are, and his, as a bishop, his getting a sense of how the Vatican treated bishops. I think that all of those feed into the kind of papacy that he's tried to have right from the beginning. Anyhow, those are a few of my loose thoughts on Francis.
Phil, you said his spirituality is based on, were you referring to the scriptural readings of the Mass each day?
Well, that's what I'm guessing, that he...
Yeah, okay. It wasn't clear to me, you know, what you were referring to. Makes sense. You know?
Well, and if you look at Evangelii Gaudium, or what, there was one of the first one. Was that the first one? Anyhow, one of the early ones. And if you read it, these things are kind of long, but if you read it with that in the back of your mind, I think you'll see that when he's talking about how you should preach and so forth. It's been years now since I've read it, but that's what comes through to me in some of these, particularly the early one or two. That again, pardon me.
Lumen Gentium, is it?
No,
That's the document on the church.
That's on the church, right?
Yeah, but I'm forgetting the names exactly of his. The first encyclical was sort of-
Oh, Evangelium Gaudium, or
Yeah.
Evangelii Gaudium.
So that's first.
Yeah. Yes, anyway, that, but I think that previous experience that I'm talking about has fed into the expressions that we see in his style and I think it looks to me like what he wants to do, this thing on the synods very quickly became things run from Rome with the conclusions already, or the parameters set out, this is what you can do. I think what he'd like to do is set up a situation where you can bring up topics and so forth. And my understanding is he wants the next synod to start at the parish level and kind of work its way up. So it's part of his de-papalizing or something that he's been trying to do.
It sure does excite opposition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're informed the young clergy in LA, and I guess indeed nationally, just can't abide the guy. You
Mm-hmm.
know, they just pine for Trent.
Well, they signed up for something else, and then I mean, you have to stop to think that if, particularly if John Paul was their model of a priest and bishop and so forth, and of the assurance of having the truth and of doing battle with the secular world, that they're not seeing that now, and they're I mean, the bishops are the result. The bishops that exist are the result of 30 years of company men.
Yep.
And that's and we now see the results. We can hope that Francis lasts long enough to water down that the bishop sufficiently so that whoever follows him is at least somewhat in his path, right?
Listen, love you guys. I'm sorry I got to pull out. Phil, thank you so much. And let's keep the flow. It's been wonderful. God bless.
Nice to
Take
see
care,
you.
John.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
John. Take care. Good trip back.
So
Well, what
George,
time is it?
It's
Well, it's already, time has moved
Almost
on.
11:30.
11:30. Yeah. Could George, you were going to ask something that I'm extremely curious about. I've got to admit that I'm a little disappointed with understanding the dynamic of Central America. And again, scale and institutions that aren't malleable or responsive. So what influence does the church have? I mean, George was impressed with the ambassador and people that he was able to gather.
no, I thought our ambassador was a complete idiot.
Well, yeah, but he had the
But he had the power of convening people, that's
exactly,
for sure.
exactly. So what about the bishops? What about the clergy in Central America? My clear understanding, which doesn't mean it's at all accurate or even anyway, is that when Romero was, before he became a bishop, that he was seen as a very conservative, quiet type of guy who had personal devotions that really kind of drove him, and that he was in no way associated with activism And when Rutilio Grande was killed, that by that time he had begun to think there's something terribly wrong here socially, and justice isn't being honored here, isn't respected, and that the murder of Rutilio Grande really blew the door open for him. But that the bishops around him, as George is saying, I mean, one of them's calling him a communist 3 years after his death, and the Pope, as you said, had by that time turned around and recognized the goodness of the man, hopefully. But what's the mix of the clergy? What's the influence of the church there in those areas? I mean, why isn't there more teaching that would raise the aspirations and the energy of the people, if that makes sense?
Well, I mean, see, one of the things we haven't mentioned is evangelicals, that
I was
they're,
just going to say that.
in Romero, in 1980, you could still assume, Romero spoke as though he was speaking to all Salvadorans. And at the time, 2 or 3% or something might, maybe a little bit more, not Catholic. But, by 1990, 2000, a significant percentage of, even by 1990 in Guatemala, not quite in Salvador, the number of church-going evangelicals and Catholics was more or less on a par. In other words, because Catholics, by and large, don't go to church, they're Catholics, they identify as Catholics, but church-going was not, and evangelicals do. So now for, let's say, 20, 30 years, evangelicals, in terms of the religion, Christianity, in most Latin American countries have been on a par with Catholics. So, and it's been hard for Catholics to accept that they no longer have a monopoly. So one of the overall problems of the Catholic Church in Latin America is the reluctance to accept de facto pluralism, which is what people live in, but the Catholic Church still tends to think of itself as the church. And, so the Catholicism has been institutionally weak forever. And one sign is the low numbers of native clergy in the various Central American countries and elsewhere. And that, that was the issue being broached at the Synod, the Amazon Synod, a couple of years ago. He wanted to broach the idea of ordaining village level men to officiate the Eucharist. And they apparently voted that way, but Francis didn't accept that. But, so the idea has been around since I went to Panama in the mid 60s. The idea that of the so-called priest shortage, that what was needed was different model of ministry and so forth. It's that long ago that it was being proposed, but not accepted. So more generally, there are heroic people, priests and sisters, particularly sisters, and some lay people doing great things, but the church is institutionally weak in that sense. And I'm not up on the current situation, so I don't know. But as it's been quite a while. But
well, it sounds to me, my pea brain here, that's kind of something that's endemic for the church in the United States. I mean, this Pew study, which I think rightly so, Tom thinks is really much to do about very little, which says that 70% of Catholics don't believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And Catholics, generally speaking, I think, seem to be so apathetic. And when I say that, I don't mean that there aren't wonderful people in each parish, who are zealous and working with the pastor and doing what has to be done practically and hopefully spiritually. But our numbers are going down. Los evangélicos are very strong. A lot of these churches, these mega churches, some which are quite good, others are just shams, in my opinion, don't seem to be doing a good job of spreading Christianity, and the church isn't. And it sounds like a macro manifestation of what you were telling us is in the Central American Catholic culture. Did that make any sense?
Well, but I'm reluctant to judge others, so I don't.
Well,
yeah.
how about the situation and not the people?
Well, again, I have to say that I'm fairly distant from, we're in 2021 and I haven't been in Latin American countries. I will recommend, I would honestly suggest my book, Latin America at 200, which was kind of written 8 years ago, 10 years ago. And what I tried to do was not just come up with a list of unsolvable problems. I tried to look for places where Latin Americans have done things right. At the time, there was a kind of growing boom, part of it driven by commodities prices, but for 10 or 15 years, living standards were rising in Latin America, particularly Brazil, where Lula, for example, said 30 or 40 million people had risen out of poverty. So there were some good things going on in terms of politics and corruption and so forth. The picture is bleaker now than it was when my book came out. But I think there's interesting stuff in the book. There's some nice pictures, but there's a lot of information, but there's I think it's the emphasis isn't on Central America, it's on all the countries. But in terms of perspective, it might be worth reading. It's a bit old now, but just in terms of your own background, your own sense of your the connection to El Salvador, and let me just I'll put in a commercial for that it might, there are chapters on various things like gender and race and economics. It's kind of a wide-ranging thing, history. I think it's a pretty good job, but it won't answer. It might be useful background. So let me just throw that out, that you might be surprised at some interesting things there.
Thank you, Phil.
I wish Grimmer were still here for this question. Phil, how do you tolerate some of our brethren on the LA Sims site? You are invariably so respectful and kind to raving idiots. I got to tell you, in 2002, I had a hip replacement, and I had found out about that site, 2 weeks before I went into surgery. And I was so looking forward to reading it while I was convalescing, et cetera, et cetera. And I was just appalled. I went and, the level of discourse. I mean, it's still it's just a nominal discussion group, Ned and Tom, and I think, oh gosh, these will be Bob Ridley. Remember him, student body president when we were at first at the ninth graders and all that. And these people, many of them are very right wing about the church and the state. But the thing that got me, Phil, is they don't reason. They just opine, and here's Phil saying, well, in 1846, blah, 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 and you got to get to the roots of the problem and analyzing it and everything. And back will come, well, yeah, but the Democrats are controlled by pedophiles. Not really. I mean, that's an absurd example. But the equivalent of that 20 years ago, whatever it was, Reagan era one-liners and stuff, just amazed to me. I finally despaired.
It helps to understand what's going on elsewhere in our culture to see these reactions. But otherwise, people are in silos saying that to each other. This thing, but the story is, which you may remember, but it began in '98 at around a reunion at Jerry Fallon's house of our class of 59, 63, whatever you want to call it. And then others began to join, other rough contemporaries, Bay and Halloran, George Sherman, and so forth. One of the things that happened in 2001 was that George Sherman died in a bike accident. This maybe a little bit before you came on.
He was still talked about for his, and every now and then somebody would say, as George said, everything is connected. Do you remember that film? It became like
actually, I think I began saying that. Fallon said it, but yes, George was, and George and I had been friends since seminary time, camp, and so forth. So we were friends over the years. But anyhow, it was a bit more balanced or something for a while. But some people became disgusted and left. But what really flipped them was that a gender changed person who had been in the seminary, it became clear that she was one of the participants, named Pearl. And at that point, Ralph Platts sort of took everybody's marbles and moved somewhere else, reacting against that. So I would say that was maybe 2005 or so. But so then it took on its current complexion around that particular event, if you want. Anyway, so it didn't begin that way, but it became that after a few years. But I just sort of think of it as the water cooler, conversation. But it is a little bit helpful to understand or to appreciate broader things happening in our culture.
well, sure. And I threw up my hands, in 2004 or 5. And is the person you're talking about somebody named Philothea? Do you remember her?
No, that was I do, and what was her connection?
Stupenchek had invited her onto the site. She had nothing to do with the seminary. She was
over the years there have been a few people like that were friends of so and so. They get in on it. No, but her name was Pearl, and she turned out to have been at St. John's and to have had a sex change, and that's what the very idea of being in a forum with somebody with a sex change is what flipped Ralph Platts, and he. It's ancient history.
That's ancient silly of Ralph. It'd be a shame on him. Was this one of the Mayer brothers?
No,
Remember
I don't
Jules
think
Mayer?
I remember him in the seminary, but no, what, but no.
We had a classmate, one
Yeah.
of the mayors.
Mhm. Anyway, no, I don't. It's always been a group of about a dozen or so that, hangers on, but anyway, and yes, you for your own sanity, you might be better just to ignore it. But
But it was just, I mean, Terry Halloran, God bless him, was on there. And Terry was as one-sided and dogmatic as any Republican,
and of course, Dubé is too. Dubé
And
is.
so you took the words from my mouth. And Bill Dubé is great with aphorisms about what idiots the institutional church are, and et cetera, right? Just everything was just Instead, I just decided to convalesce reading The Three Musketeers, which I'd never done and which I enjoyed. But anyway, Phil, I bought your book while we've been talking, your your memoir, and was glancing at it. Where
All
was
three of us did.
Hollydale?
If you take,
I grew up in Bell.
okay, it was not far. If you kind of take, doesn't exist anymore, but if you sort of take Downey, Linwood, Paramount, or Downey, anyhow, those areas, or it's right off of Garfield Boulevard, if that means, which becomes Cherry in Long Beach. Well, it's off of there. It's still there. It's actually, the houses look 60 years older, 70 years older. The trees are, if they're around, are 70 years taller, but but a lot of the stuff is there, and it's a Latino area, as is a lot of Southern California.
Yeah, that goes without saying.
Yeah. Very Latino. In our day, it was Okies and Arkies, but
Right. So was Bell and Bell Gardens, Maywood, where I live.
Yeah.
What's an East-West Street that would have crossed Garfield Cherry?
Well, right there, Imperial Highway, farther.
Okay.
Between, I've over the years gone there a few times, kind of driving around, showing our kids. I mean, a very few years, but I want to say 2016, I went to Southern California, doing research on my memoir, but really just to, I spent 10 days or 2 weeks or something going around interviewing Terry, Juan Romero, Pete Nugent, a few people like that. And, it didn't really add, but went with my sister and a nephew. We took bikes and we biked over that area. So we biked to Paramount, to the ice rink where we went, but we actually went into school, Our Lady of the Rosary School, and Pius X High School, and over to Southgate Park and St. Francis Hospital where I worked. And so anyhow, what did all of that do? I don't know. We biked around. We spent a day seeing these scenes of, and it's still there.
And at St. Francis, your job was washing dishes, right?
Yes. And delivering food up on the, there were a couple of seminarians there
that wonderful little nun got me a job washing dishes there. And I quit after about 2 weeks to go work at a White Rock Bottling Company and get a real salary,
Okay.
And I don't think she appreciated it.
That was Sister Consuelo, I think.
I can't remember her name.
Yeah, there were two of them, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting that we're, anyway. But so when I go to Southern California, I get this mix of deja vu and things have changed, kind of, because I've only gone some of my family is still there, but I only go occasionally.
Are you active in the church in Philadelphia?
We attend St. Malachy's parish, and Angie is more active in the parish than I am, but yeah, we are. Actually, she and I and a Jesuit are going to be helping the local Catholic Peace Fellowship with a retreat around Fratelli Tutti in October. So, and it's connected to the parish. So, yeah, moderately, yes. But,
What did you think of Chaput?
the less, the better. That, frankly, he was, but we didn't have to deal with him. Actually, who was here was Justin Regali for several years, who was 2 years ahead of me in the seminary. He was also, sort of a non-entity as Archbishop. But,
He inflamed.
the parish we're at, St. Malachy's, we've been going there for 30 years, and basically followed Jack McNamee, a priest who was the kind of local friend of Dan Berrigan and so forth. So in Philly is a non-progressive place, but he was the priest that people came to, and like Berrigan was a friend of his. And when Ivan Illich came here, he would stay with Jack. And so anyhow, Jack's been a friend all these years. And only recently, we've been marginally involved in his going to the priest's villa. He was resisting going, but other people were helping him more, but we've been seeing him and staying in contact with him. And that's one of the things we're seeing is our contemporaries needing more care. And, just down the street, there's this couple, 2 women, but one of them has Alzheimer's, and she just yesterday, after some months of doing things, has been placed at a Quaker place, and which all seems to be going well. But that's kind of one of the things on our mind is seeing that around us at least.
The reason I asked you about Chaput is he for years would be quoted once a year as saying the problem with the American church is JFK's sellout before the Houston Ministerial Alliance in 1960. And I know that speech kind of well, and I've never been able to figure out what the sellout was. Do you know?
No, and like I said, I read some things of Chaput, but I, like I say, didn't try not to pay much attention to that. So I don't know, but he does fancy himself an intellectual leader, and he wrote some other 20-page thing, or not exactly a manifesto, but a statement. Mm-hmm. So yes, he is one of the intellectual leaders of that faction of bishops, and still is, I think.
Anyway,
the new Archbishop, who's arrived shortly before the pandemic, Nelson Perez, seems to be a pastorally minded person, and good. Now he's been out of sight really because of the pandemic, but I think we can hope that has some pastoral instincts and is maybe more of a Francis bishop than any of the ones we've had.
He's from Washington, isn't he? Someone?
Pardon me?
He's from the state of Washington, someone?
No, I think he's from a Cuban American family in Miami, but he went to the seminary here. And the story I've heard was that maybe it was Kroll, one of the archbishops, wanted him here, but then he's been elsewhere. But he's East Coast. That's my understanding. But by contrast with the previous he looks relatively good. Not much more than that I know.
I read some hopeful articles in the Philly newspapers about the new bishop. Anyway.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's getting to be about that time.
Yeah, I think so.
Um,
Phil's got better things to do, I'm sure.
yeah, but thanks so much, Phil. I didn't participate too much, but I definitely enjoyed the.
Well, why don't you guys each tell me a little bit about yourselves? I mean, the 1 or 2 minute version or something. You were at our Claremont, right?
I was, yeah, I was 15 years in Claremont following Bill Berry, and then 6 years in Beverly Hills, which was not the best place to go out from. I the people are too controlling, shall we say. I had a great time in Claremont following Bill, and it's a lively, dynamic community, still is.
Mhm.
Wait, who was controlling Tom?
Beverly Hills.
Ah.
I think they were looking for somebody who would be a caretaker, and I was not wanting to be a caretaker, but 6 years there was enough, and I personally feel that I kind of got burned out. So might as well step aside before I'm completely a vegetable and get
But so you
kind of
are,
get into more interesting stuff.
but so you are retired. You're
So I'm-
doing your coffee ministry.
I've got that with some people from basically from Claremont, and doing spiritual direction, and also last year I left Nazareth House and came to stay with a friend who was in need of some support for her health, and it still is, she's fairly weak, but I'm able to have my own territory here, and we get along well. And what else?
And what part of town? What part of town are you in?
I'm in Redondo Beach
Uh-huh.
right now. And well, in fact, that's a window looking east, but that window looks west, and I can see the ocean through palm trees. So
Wow.
I'm
Mhm. And Ned and George, briefly, what?
Go ahead, George.
Well, let's see, I quit the seminary in '64 at the end of college, SEU second philosophy in those days. Got a job at Salesian High School in Boyle Heights for 7 years. And while there, I guess I would say I was kind of radicalized, right, Ned?
I would say,
Yeah, certainly fell on the left side of the American spectrum. From there, I went to law school, practiced law, doing corporate litigation, really, for about 74 to 98. So whatever, 24 years. Didn't really like it much. So in '98, I joined a firm that specialized in representing disabled school kids. So if any of your grandchildren have, God forbid, autism or Down syndrome or something, you probably have heard of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that's the statute under which we practice law. And last October of 20, I open quote, retired, period, close quote, and am practicing some and sort of casting about. I've come up with this theory that old age is to become holy during. If we're not going to do it then, we're not going to do it, it seems, things come to a screeching halt. But I just haven't figured out how to, get away from my surly self yet and do that. So that's my story. Got divorced along the way in 1982-ish, remarried. Speaking of the real presence, for a long time, I just refused to get an annulment because I thought it was bullshit. And I continued going to communion because nobody was going to tell me I couldn't go to communion to control my sex life. Who do they think they are? And then was finally persuaded otherwise by my Jesuit friend, my wife, my brother-in-law, who was the former Bishop of San Bernardino Riverside, Barnes by name. So that's me. What I leave out, Ned?
5-minute version. Raised in East Los Angeles, across the street from Maravilla, if you know Maravilla. Went to a parish where this Irish pastor took me under his wing. I really kind of fell in love with Irish culture. From grammar school, went to Our Lady Queen of the Angels, left, my pastor got me back in, and then spent time till I got ordained to the diaconate, got invited into the priesthood, and declined because I wanted to get into parishes and understand what that was like. I was not enamored in the least with Cardinal McIntyre and Monsignor Hawks. I was very much happy about the Vatican Council, but saw a lot of turmoil following the council among particularly our priests and religious, and spent a year and a half in 3 different parishes. Hawks was very upset. He scolded me quite thoroughly, told me he was going to send me to a priest who was going to break me, and told me that there were various things I could not do. So I spent time in St. Dorothy's, West Covina. I'm sorry, Christopher's in West Covina, St. Dorothy's in, I can't remember at the moment.
Glendora.
Pardon me? Glendora.
Glendora.
Yeah. And St. Joseph's, a little tiny hovel place. We had a 2-bedroom little home across the street from a very tiny church. And the pastor would leave the rectory after the last mass on Sunday, and I wouldn't see him till Friday or Saturday morning, when he might or might not hear confessions, and then he'd celebrate a couple of masses and then be gone again. The principal of the school and I ran the parish, and I continued to get untoward messages from Monsignor Hawks. So I left, went to teach at Salesian, where George was, for a couple of years. Wound up through a twist of circumstances on the national campaign headquartered in Washington, D.C. of George McGovern. Spent about a year and a little plus on that campaign. It was an amazing eye-opener with respect to politics. From there, I went to law school, litigated for 5 years, wound up in a large major corporation. I thought I was going to become a lawyer, a counsel in a development company, but it turned out to be a small subsidiary. It was a large company, but it was a subsidiary of Union Oil Company of California, eventually Unical. And so I spent the next 25 or so years there, retired, and with some friends put together, and on the advice of George, established a nonprofit corporation, Justice in Education, representing low-income parents who had children with disabilities. And boy, that was another eye-opener. Got to, care for the children and respect the parents just immensely. I mean, when you live 24/7 with some of the kinds of trauma that your children visit on you, loving them the whole time, you just can't not respect and love those parents. And retired from that a couple of years ago, and have been active in the church in our parish since then. I'm kind of a middle of the roader, although I come across, as I'm told, as a very conservative guy. I've always found that a fairly middle of the road or slightly to the left of the road is something that's applicable across the board in faith matters. So that's me.
Well, I appreciate these few minutes to hear this. That's helpful for me.
Phil, I've been stealing glances at your memoir. We could have been going to the same grammar school culturally, and lived on the same street, except your family subscribed to the Herald Examiner. You said, and I was a paper boy for the Daily News because we were good Democrat union members.
Yeah, my family was Democrat, but it was an evening paper. I think that's probably why we got it.
Yeah.
I was a delivery boy for the Huntington Park Daily Signal.
Daily Signal, I just read that. We took that. We subscribed to that paper.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
old times.
Yeah.
Well,
Phil, I got to ask. If you have time, we spent a fair amount of time with Fred Lawrence and George Ferrick, and Ned and I, or at least who got out of the seminary and weren't ordained into the Archdiocese of LA during that time period. And I keep telling Ned, well, I think like George is very jaundiced about the church institutionally. I mean, and I said, what would you have done if you'd been a newly ordained priest and had slowly, maybe without articulating it to yourself, come to the conclusion that the Archdiocese of LA was evil? I mean, look at the way they treated your, I use the term advisedly, mentor, Father Coalfield, McIntyre and Hoggs. How did you handle that? Or
I didn't become, actually, if you read the memoir, there's the whole incident of my being kicked out of a parish for preaching a sermon on race.
Yeah, I'm
in
not there
64.
yet, but I'm
Yeah,
moving in
but
that
anyway, even when that, and I was, and I saw, you can read it, but basically I saw the dishonesty because that's what happened. The sermon was Sunday, the phone call was Monday, the chancery was Tuesday, and moving was Wednesday. That's how it happened. But they pretended that it was routine. That's what they called it and so forth. I mean, they publicly, they did. But so I saw a table of monsignors and a couple bishops. Ward was there. Manning may have been there, and they all nodded their head and went along with it. So I had that experience of, but I was on my way to Panama where it was going to be interesting. And even before I went to see McIntyre, and he was paternalistic, but okay with my going. And I went to see Monsignor North, who had gotten me kicked out. And he was also sort of paternalistic, but okay. In other words, I went to see both of them just as a gesture to, I'm on my way, I'll just, so my, and then I went to this very exciting situation for 8 years in Panama and in Latin America, because I studied and traveled and became networked into something was going on. So my experience was positive. And the archdiocese was at arm's length. So that was but around me there were people who became angry, and there were people who, Harry Dawson, a classmate of ours,
I remember Harry.
within a few months, he had a drinking problem. With a few months of ordination, he left, and he never really managed to, and he killed himself in the late 70s. Now this is, over 10 years later, but I would say it goes back to something that happened in the church system. Not entirely, but I didn't know, but I mean, that's an example how some people really were hurt. And so you don't want to minimize that, but my own experience was relatively benign. But I learned to, to stand up and not, I had 12 years of conditioning that obedience is the most important virtue. And I began to get out of that. But, anyway.
Yeah. Well, you got out of Dodge early, down to
Yes.
South America. Or
Well,
Panama.
one of the things was within my second year in Panama, I was pastor of a poor downtown parish, but I was pastor, and that, so I wasn't enduring the system that my contemporaries would have. So again, it was my own experience was, and one thing led to another, still finding my vocation. But anyway, well, folks, I think we do have to.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all. And thank you very much, Phil. And this was a wonderful time. I think we all agree.
Yes,
Thank you.
very much.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Phil. God
Oh.
bless.
Let us say goodbye with God's
Okay.
blessings.
Take care.